It was the middle of the night, sometime after midnight probably, and Judas is looking for Jesus. He goes up to the upper room, perhaps, the last place he had seen Jesus. The room being empty, he thinks he knows where Jesus might be, and he leads his gang of thugs to the Garden of Gethsemane. And there, just as Jesus has told his disciples who were asleep to wake up, the Bible tells us in Matthew 26, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man, seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. Now Jesus is no victim here. He's no martyr dragged off against his will to pay a price for his crimes. He's still in complete control, even to the point of telling Judas, giving him permission to do what it is he came to do. And then began the Jewish trials. But they began in a way that's rather unexpected. He's taken first to Annas. The Bible tells us in John 18, first they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. They should have gone to Caiaphas first, but instead they went to Annas, his father-in-law. This reveals to us who's really pulling the strings, who's really the power behind all that is happening. Soon, they do send him to Caiaphas, and we read something interesting there. Later in Matthew 26, those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see to the end. Now Peter had earlier declared to Jesus that he would never leave him, that he could always count on Peter to be there with him when he needed him most. He even said that he would be loyal to the end, but we all know that's not what happened. A little bit later on in this same chapter, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him and said, "You were with Jesus the Galilean." And he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And he went out to the entrance. Another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And then Luke adds this sad detail. And the Lord looked at Peter. I'm sure it wasn't a glare, it wasn't anger, but a sadness and a compassion for the one he loved who had fallen. But as we return to the trial, we see the leaders acting, and they are in a hurry. They know the Passover meal is coming. They know the Sabbath is tomorrow. They know things are going to get done. Now that they are in motion, they have to get done today. And so they begin looking for witnesses. They can't find any. So they invent some. And they get individuals who will give a false witness. And during all of this, Jesus, of course, remains completely silent. He knows the charges are false. He knows the outcome is already determined, not so much by these individuals whose minds are already made up, but the determined plan of God, that this is how he must suffer and die. Finally, the high priest asks the right question, and then the room explodes with Jesus' answer. In Matthew 26:63, the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Finally, Jesus spoke, and he said, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Jesus applies both Daniel 7 and Psalm 110 to himself, declaring that he truly is the divine Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ. Upon hearing this, the high priest tore his robe and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." And it's at this point the beatings began. The prophecy from Isaiah is fulfilled, that his appearance was so marred that it was beyond human semblance. Later, in Matthew 27, when morning came, finally, All the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. They'd got what they wanted, a charge that would stick against Jesus, but they couldn't do anything with it. Some 3 years earlier, Pilate had removed from the Jews the ability to enact capital punishment. That belonged only to the Romans. And so the Jews, in order to have Jesus executed, had to go through Rome. Pilate didn't care if Jesus was a blasphemer. He cared very little. He just wanted to keep the peace. But for that reason, the Jewish leaders changed their charge from blasphemy to treason, saying that Jesus had declared himself to be a king, opposing the authority of Caesar. Pilate asked Jesus if he was a king, and Jesus assures Pilate that Pilate has nothing to worry about from him, saying that my kingdom is not of this world. So Pilate has nothing to do with it. He instead sends Jesus to Herod. Now Herod has heard about Jesus. He might remember that he tried to kill him earlier. I'm not sure if he knew Jesus was alive in Bethlehem at that time. But Herod had heard about Jesus lately, and he only wanted to see Jesus do some miracles, a dog and pony show. And here, Jesus once again said absolutely nothing to King Herod. This is when they began to mock Jesus. They put the purple robe upon him, and then finally growing bored, Herod sends him back to Pilate. And here at his 6th trial, we see the final verdict. Pilate offers Jesus and Barabbas to the crowd to choose one, as had become the custom, and they chose Barabbas. And so Pilate pulled Jesus aside privately, and he's just confounded by this man. It does not make sense. No prisoner has ever acted this way in front of him. And Pilate asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" And Jesus does not answer. Perhaps growing a little frustrated, Pilate says, "Do you not know I have the authority, your very life in my hands?" And this is when Jesus said, "You have no authority over me, unless it was granted you from my Father above." And at this, Pilate is further confounded. He's shaken, and he is determined to release Jesus. And the leaders know this, which is why they issue their final threat. And they declare, if you do this, if you release Jesus, you are an enemy of Caesar. And that's the final straw. That's all that needed to be said. This was the last threat to Pilate. He wouldn't want anything from Caesar coming down upon him, and things are now whirling out of control, and he has no way out, and he knows what he has to do. He washes his hands to let the Jewish leaders and the people know that he is innocent of this and that the blood will not rest on him. And that's when the Jews make their final declaration. May his blood be upon us and our children. And this final verdict, it occurs right around noontime, about the time when all the Passover lambs are beginning to be executed and slain. In Matthew 27, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him. And they took the reed, and they struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, and put his own clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. Weary, weak from the loss of blood and the beatings, he stumbled. The soldiers commanded a citizen, a man named Simon from the region of Cyrene, to come and pick up Jesus' cross, and they led him up the hill outside the gate, and there they nailed him to the cross. The thief on one side and another on the other, one believed and one didn't. Jesus told the one who believed that he would wake up in paradise very soon. And Jesus hanged there on one of the cruelest methods of torture this world has ever seen. In Luke 23 we read, "It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, from noon until 3. The sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hand I commit my spirit.'" John adds, when he had received the sour wine to drink, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head, and he gave up his spirit. Jesus was dead. The cup of God's wrath was empty, and God was satisfied. Somehow the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, the eternal God himself, Jesus Christ, was dead, bearing the sin of humanity and enduring it all on a cruel cross. After he was dead, in Matthew 27, one of his secret followers gathered up the courage to do what he thought he needed to do, and again to fulfill that great prophecy from Isaiah 53, that when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea called Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. And he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. The leaders were still concerned. They had heard Jesus declare that he would be raised from the dead. And they thought, well, that's not going to happen. But perhaps his followers will try to steal the body and claim that Jesus had risen. And so they came to the Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead, and this last fraud would be worse than the first." And following after this is surely one of the most darkly humorous sentences that were ever written. In Matthew 27, verse 65, Pilate said to them, "I will give you a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can."